On April 11, 1945, at 3:15 p.m., the timeline of the Third Reich snapped. A specialized unit of the U.S. 6th Armored Division, led by Captain Frederick Keffer, rolled their tanks through the dense Thuringian forest and breached the perimeter of a facility the SS had desperately tried to hide. This was Buchenwald. Just days earlier, a frantic order had come directly from Berlin, authorized by Heinrich Himmler and endorsed by Adolf Hitler. No prisoner was to fall into Allied hands alive. The camp was to be liquidated, the evidence burned, and the site razed. It was a directive of total erasure. The Nazis knew that Buchenwald was not just a prison, it was a factory of death that proved the moral bankruptcy of their entire ideology. If the Americans saw it, the psychological war was lost. But the German efficiency had failed. The speed of General Patton's Third Army had outpaced the SS execution squads. Instead of finding a smoldering ruin, American troops found 21,000 living witnesses and tons of documentation that the SS had failed to destroy in their panic. When the first American tank crashed through the barbed wire, the guards had already fled, leaving behind a scene that would traumatize battle-hardened soldiers for the rest of their lives. The timeline of the Holocaust shifted from rumor to undeniable fact in a single afternoon. The failure to destroy Buchenwald was a catastrophic blunder for the Nazi high command. It meant the world would see the piles of bodies, the starvation, and the instruments of torture exactly as they were. Before we dive into the specific intelligence that reached Hitler's desk and his terrifying reaction to this failure, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. The story of this intelligence failure begins with a secret hidden inside the camp itself. The survival of Buchenwald was not an accident. It was an act of sabotage from within. For months, an underground resistance committee formed by communist prisoners and political dissidents had been preparing for this moment. They had stolen rifle parts, one by one, from the Gustloff armaments factory, where they were forced to work, hiding them under floorboards and inside buckets of latrine waste. But their most dangerous weapon was a shortwave radio receiver and a small transmitter constructed from stolen scraps of wire and vacuum tubes. While Hitler moved imaginary armies on maps in Berlin, the prisoners of Buchenwald were listening to the real war. On April 8th, they intercepted Allied broadcasts. They knew Patton's tanks were less than 20 miles away. The SS commander, Hermann Pister, ordered a mass evacuation, a death march intended to clear the camp before the Americans arrived. The resistance leaders made a calculated, life-or-death decision. They would delay. Senior prisoners in administrative positions falsified roll calls. They claimed typhus outbreaks to keep SS guards out of the barracks. When the order came to assemble for the march, thousands of prisoners simply refused to move, hiding in a labyrinth of the camp. The SS, terrified by the approaching artillery thunder of the U.S. Army, lost their nerve. They didn't have the time to hunt down 21,000 men. The rigid discipline of the camp collapsed under the pressure of the American advance. The prisoners had bought time with deception, but the SS still had machine guns trained on the central square, waiting for the final order to open fire. The tipping point arrived at midday on April 11th. As the sound of American tank treads grew louder, the SS guards in the watchtowers began to abandon their posts. They stripped off their uniforms, donning civilian clothes stolen from prisoners, hoping to blend into the fleeing populace. The prisoner resistance saw the wavering resolve and launched their uprising. At 2:30 p.m., the hidden weapons were retrieved. A ragged army of starving men, armed with 91 rifles and one machine gun, stormed the watchtowers. They weren't waiting for liberation. They were seizing it. By the time Captain Keffer's tanks arrived at the gate at 3:15 p.m., the tower guns were manned not by Nazis, but by the prisoners themselves. The white flag flying over the main gate hadn't been raised by the Germans in surrender, but by the inmates in victory. The Americans didn't have to fight their way in. They were welcomed into a zone of absolute horror that was already under self-rule. This created a unique situation in the history of the war. The camp was intact. The crematoriums were cold, but standing. The administrative offices, containing the registry of deaths, and the orders from Berlin, were secured by the prisoners before the fleeing Nazis could torch them. The evidence Hitler so desperately wanted destroyed was now under armed guard by the very people he intended to erase. The soldiers of the 6th Armored Division had fought from the beaches of Normandy to the German border. They had seen friends blown apart by artillery and had killed enemy soldiers in close combat. They were desensitized to violence, but nothing had prepared them for the smell of Buchenwald. It was a physical wall of stench, decaying flesh, dysentery, and burning hair that hit them a mile before they saw the wire. When they dismounted their vehicles, they entered a world where the laws of humanity had been suspended. In the little camp, the quarantine section, they found men sleeping on bare wood shelves, 5 to a bunk, too weak to move. The dead lay among the living. Soldiers reported seeing skeletons who collapsed and died at the feet of their liberators, their hearts failing from the shock of joy. Combat reports from that day describe tough American GIs vomiting on the side of the road. Some wept openly. Others went silent, their faces hardening into a mask of cold fury. They found the corpse yard near the crematorium, where bodies were stacked like cordwood because the ovens couldn't keep up with the dying. They found the hooks on the walls of the basement torture chambers. This wasn't war. This was industrial slaughter. The initial radio reports sent back to headquarters were frantic and disjointed, struggling to find the vocabulary to describe the scene. These reports moved up the chain of command with lightning speed, eventually crossing the Atlantic and the English Channel, but also leaking into the intelligence networks that fed into Berlin. News of the American breakthrough in Thuringia reached the Führer bunker in Berlin within hours. The situation in the bunker was already one of disintegration. The Red Army was closing in on the Oder River to the east, and the Americans were slicing through central Germany to the west. But the specific loss of Buchenwald carried a different weight than the loss of a bridge or a city. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had promised Hitler that the camps would be sanitized. The standing order, the Führerbefehl, was clear. The camp must be surrendered to the enemy only after it has been completely liquidated. The reports coming into the Reich Chancellery confirmed a total failure of this directive. The Americans hadn't just captured territory, they had captured the crime scene. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere shifted from military desperation to paranoid accusation. Hitler, whose health was rapidly failing, prone to tremors and sudden rages, received the news not as a humanitarian tragedy, but as a betrayal by the SS. The preservation of Buchenwald was proof of incompetence and treason. The Supermen of the SS had run away like cowards, leaving the Reich's secrets exposed to the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy he believed controlled the Allied powers. The fallout was immediate. According to transcripts and post-war interrogations of bunker personnel, Hitler's reaction to the liberation of the camps was characterized by a disconnect from reality. He did not express remorse. He did not ask about the prisoners. His focus was entirely on the political damage and the disobedience of his officers. He reportedly ranted that the SS had gone soft, that they lacked the hardness required for the final struggle. He viewed the survival of the prisoners as a military threat. These were enemies of the state who would now be rearmed by the Americans. But more deeply, he was enraged that the evidence of the final solution was now in enemy hands. Hitler had always operated on the principle that history is written by the victors. He believed that if he won, the methods wouldn't matter. Now, facing defeat, he realized that the camps would be the monuments of his legacy. He lashed out at Himmler's subordinates, accusing them of leaving a gift for Allied propaganda. In his distorted worldview, the Americans were not liberating victims. They were staging a production to humiliate Germany. He demanded to know why the crematoriums hadn't been blown up, why the archives hadn't been burned. The failure to destroy Buchenwald was, in his eyes, a final act of sabotage against him personally. Hitler's cognitive dissonance regarding the camps was profound. While he had ordered the extermination, he rarely visited the sites or looked at photos of the results. He dealt in abstractions and numbers. The liberation of Buchenwald forced the concrete reality into his strategic sphere. He dismissed the American reports as, quote, atrocity propaganda, a term the Germans had used since World War I to discredit Allied accusations. He told his inner circle that the Americans would use these staged scenes to justify the destruction of the German people. He projected his own guilt onto the Allies, claiming they would starve German POWs in retaliation. This narrative of victimhood became the primary topic of conversation in the bunker's final weeks. However, the speed of the information flow made it impossible to maintain the lie, even internally. The British BBC and American radio broadcasts were beaming the details of Buchenwald across Europe. German civilians were hearing it. The soldiers in the bunker were hearing it. Hitler's attempt to frame the liberation as a lie was crumbling in real time. The propaganda was backed by photographs that were already being developed and prepared for release to the world press. While Hitler fumed in his bunker, General George S. Patton arrived at Buchenwald on April 15th. Patton was known as, quote, old blood and guts, a warrior who glorified combat and despised cowardice. He had seen the worst of World War I and II. Yet, Buchenwald broke him. Upon walking through the barracks and seeing the emaciated survivors, Patton withdrew to a corner of the camp and vomited. His sickness was quickly replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. He was known for his strict discipline and, sometimes, controversial views, but faced with the Nazi atrocity, his moral compass snapped into rigid alignment. He refused to let this be hidden. He ordered his military police to round up the citizens of Weimar, the cultural capital of Germany, located just a few miles away. These civilians claimed ignorance. They said they didn't know what was happening up on the hill, despite the smoke from the crematorium drifting over their homes for years. Patton didn't care about their excuses. He famously said, I want every damn one of them to see this. He was going to force the truth down their throats. The next day, under armed American guard, 1,000 citizens of Weimar, men, women, and teenagers, were marched up the hill to Buchenwald. This was one of the most significant psychological operations of the war. It wasn't about punishment, it was about witnessing. The civilians arrived dressed in their Sunday best, smiling nervously, perhaps thinking this was a standard occupation formality. As they passed through the gates, the smiles vanished. The Americans forced them to walk past the piles of unburied bodies. They were made to look into the ovens, which still contained charred skeletal remains. They were paraded past tables, displaying the tattooed skin of prisoners that had been preserved as trophies by the SS guards. Women fainted. Men wept. Some covered their faces, but the GIs shouted at them to look, pulling their hands away. The narrative that we didn't know was destroyed in a single afternoon. This forced tour created a precedent. It established that the German populace bore a collective responsibility, not for the crime itself, but for the willful blindness that allowed it. The images of these well-dressed civilians standing next to trailers of corpses became some of the most powerful indictments of the Nazi regime. Among the horrors revealed to the world was the legacy of Ilse Koch, the wife of the former commandant. Prisoners testified to her sadism, earning her the nickname, the Bitch of Buchenwald. But it was the physical evidence found in the pathology lab that shocked the American investigators the most. They found lampshades made of human skin. They found shrunken heads and preserved organs. This wasn't just industrial killing. This was fetishistic cruelty. It proved that the camp wasn't just a military necessity or a penal colony, as Hitler might have argued. It was a playground for psychopaths empowered by the state. When reports of these artifacts reached the press, they stripped away any remaining veneer of military legitimacy the Wehrmacht or SS might have tried to claim. It painted the Nazi leadership not as soldiers, but as monsters. Hitler's attempt to frame the war as a noble defense of European civilization against Bolshevism was shattered by the reality of Ilse Koch's living room lamps. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the camp shortly after Patton. Eisenhower was a man of immense self-control, but the sights of Buchenwald shook him to his core. He had a prophetic realization. He knew that in the future people would try to deny this happened, that they would call it propaganda or exaggeration. He issued an immediate order to every unit near the area. He wanted every soldier not on the front line to tour the camp. He called in journalists, congressmen, and photographers. He famously stated, "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Eisenhower was fighting a future war against Holocaust denial. Before the shooting war had even ended, he ordered the creation of a massive visual archive. This decision is the reason we have the footage today. It was a deliberate strategic move to create an undeniable historical record, directly countering Hitler's hope that the evidence would vanish. The American Signal Corps arrived with 35mm motion picture cameras. They filmed the barracks, the survivors, the crematoriums, and the piles of victims. This footage was raw, shaking, and silent, but it was undeniable. They documented the medical experiments, the starvation rations, and the testimony of the prisoners. The urgency was extreme. Typhus was rampant in the camp. To save the living, the Americans would eventually have to burn down the infected barracks and bury the dead in mass graves. There was a narrow window of time where the camp stood exactly as the SS left it. The cameramen worked around the clock, treating the site like a crime scene investigation on a massive scale. This footage was rushed to theaters in the United States and Britain. It played before feature films and newsreels. For the first time, the public saw what their sons were fighting against. It transformed the war from a geopolitical struggle into a moral crusade. The Why We Fight series used this footage to galvanize the final push into Germany. In the final days before the liberation, the SS had frantically tried to cover their tracks. They had smashed the skulls of prisoners in the pathology ward to hide the evidence of execution methods. They had burned thousands of files. They had dug up mass graves to burn the decomposing bodies on railway tracks. A specialized unit called Sonderkommando *1005 was tasked with this grisly work across the Reich. But at Buchenwald, the chaos was their undoing. They missed the death book, the meticulously kept register of every prisoner who died in the camp. They missed the clandestine records, kept by the prisoner scribes who worked in the administrative offices. These men had made duplicate copies of execution orders and hidden them. The Nazis were victims of their own bureaucracy. They documented everything, and when the collapse came, they couldn't burn the paper fast enough. The Americans found filing cabinets full of incriminating evidence that linked the camp administration directly to Berlin. The paper trail was as damning as the bodies. The most powerful evidence wasn't paper or film, it was the people. Among the survivors in the children's block was a young Elie Wiesel. He and others began to speak. They told the Americans about the daily routines, the selections, the brutality of the capos, and the indifference of the guards. These testimonies provided the context that the silent bodies could not. They explained the system. They explained that Buchenwald wasn't just a place where people died. It was a place designed to kill the human soul before killing the body. The Americans listened. Translators worked in shifts to record these stories. The survivors described the arrival of transports from Auschwitz and the death marches. They connected Buchenwald to the wider network of the Holocaust, revealing that this was just one node in a continent-spanning machine of destruction. The liberation of Buchenwald had a direct impact on the surrender negotiations. There were factions within the Allied command who considered a negotiated peace with the German military, bypassing Hitler. But after Buchenwald, the mood hardened. There could be no negotiation with a regime that produced such horrors. Unconditional surrender became the only acceptable outcome. The moral stain was too deep to allow any remnant of the Nazi government to survive. The discovery silenced the anti-war voices in America and Britain. It provided the moral justification for the harsh occupation policies that would follow. Hitler's hope for a split between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, that the West would join him to fight the Communists, was destroyed by the reality of the camps. The Americans looked at Buchenwald and saw an evil that rivaled anything they feared from Stalin. The evidence gathered at Buchenwald traveled directly to Nuremberg. When the International Military Tribunal convened in late 1945, the prosecutors didn't just have witnesses. They had the death book. They had the films Eisenhower ordered. They had the lampshades. This evidence was crucial in convicting the Nazi leadership. Men like Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Hermann Göring had to sit in the dock and watch the films of Buchenwald. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed, and the screen flickered with the images of the bulldozers pushing bodies into graves. The prosecutors watched the defendants' faces. Some looked away. Some cried. Göring pretended to be bored. But the evidence was insurmountable. Buchenwald testified from the grave. Hitler's attempt to erase the crime had resulted in the most documented crime in human history. In the end, Hitler's reaction in the bunker, his rage at the incompetence of the SS, was the final delusion of a dying tyrant. He believed the evidence could be destroyed because he believed he could rewrite reality through will alone. He was wrong. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, was a victory of truth over silence. The Americans arrived just in time to catch the monster red-handed. The 21,000 survivors, the 6th Armored Division, and the cameras of the Signal Corps ensured that the world would never forget. Today, Buchenwald stands as a memorial. The gate still bears the cynical inscription Jedem das Sein, to each his own. But thanks to the speed of the Allied advance and the courage of the prisoner resistance, the meaning of that place was not defined by the Nazis, but by those who liberated it. The evidence survived. The truth survived. And because of that, we know exactly what evil looks like. If you found this history valuable, please like, share this video, and comment below with your thoughts on Eisenhower's decision to film the camps.